Hello, and a very warm welcome to all of you to this F4B and China Dialogue webinar on a critical topic for nature, where the money goes. Everything we depend on for life depends on nature in one way or another, so it makes no sense to destroy nature for short-term profit. That will, in effect, destroy the livability of our planet, but that's what we're doing. We have to change where and how we invest so that we protect instead of destroying nature, and we don't have much time to do it. So we on China Dialogue have been publishing on this in partnership with F4B, so please check out the articles on the website. This is the year that China will host the postponed CBD COP15, the Convention on Biodiversity Conference of the Parties, and it's a key moment in the so far not very successful effort to stop the mass extinction that we're living through. It'll happen against the background of a pandemic that's got both big lessons on the importance of preserving nature and possibly a big opportunity to rethink if we're wise enough to take it. We have a lot to discuss and we have a wonderful panel. We're going to begin with two introductory videos from panelists who, for time zone reasons, couldn't be here live, but are big experts in the field. First, we're going to hear from Deborah Lehr of the Paulson Institute. She's Vice Chair and Executive Director of the Paulson Institute, and amongst other accomplishments too numerous to list, she also heads the Paulson Institute's Green Finance Center, and she's going to give us a brief overview of green finance development in China, of the biodiversity challenge, and how that experience could position China to be a leader in the field. And she'll be followed directly by Professor Kevin Gallagher of Boston University, again, familiar to many of you in this field for his pioneering and important work. And again, amongst many other accomplishments, Kevin co-chairs the T20 Task Force on International Financial Architecture at the G20 and co-chaired CCICED Special Task Force on greening the BRI, which he'll tell us more about. Then we'll go on to the panel discussion, and then we will hope to hear from you and answer some questions in the closing session. So let's take a look first at the introductions and the videos.
Good morning and good evening to all the listeners on the webinar today. I'm delighted to be invited and to be sharing the stage with such esteemed experts and partners, and many are good friends. I'd like to thank the Finance for Biodiversity Initiative and the China Dialogue for hosting this very timely and important meeting. The year ahead is indeed one in which the twin agendas of biodiversity and climate change are front and center. Building on the carbon-related commitments from China, Japan, and South Korea, the rejoining of the Paris Agreement by the United States, the growing push from finance giants and central banks around the world to transform the industry, and the increasing number of corporate leaders charting a new way forward for their businesses, 2021 is poised to be a transformational year for green finance. Of course, when the delayed convening of the CBD COP15 in China and the COP26 in the United Kingdom take place this year, they will serve as critical markers for progress. While the health pandemic rages on in the world, but hope is in sight with the development and deployment of effective vaccines, there's another scourge that continues to face us. These are the risks brought on by climate change and biodiversity loss. In both of these areas, China is a key player. As the largest carbon emitter in the world, what China does or doesn't do has significant consequences. Fortunately, China has chosen to do a lot. Recognizing the environmental damage that the fast pace of economic development caused over the last decade, China's embarked upon an ambitious program for green finance. As you'll hear more about on this panel, China has also seen the development of a national carbon market since then, green finance pilot zones, and the proliferation of its green bonds market. The national carbon market was launched officially in 2017, following years of pilot exchanges, and is set to begin actually trading, hopefully in the middle of this year. Rules that establish the framework for trading are effective very soon, on February 1st. For the power industries that will be the participants first in this market. Similar to the concept of economic free trade zones, China established 6 official green finance pilot projects in Zhejiang, Jiangxi, Guangdong, Guizhou, Xinjiang, and Gansu that are testing specific green finance-related policies and innovations locally to help inform and hopefully scale to the national level. We've seen some very interesting developments coming out of those zones. China's green bond market has also taken off. At the end of November 2020, the green bonds market was valued at $164.9 billion, compared with less than $1 billion at the end of 2014. And according to the Climate Bonds Initiative, latest 2020 totals, China issued $17.2 billion in green bonds last year, despite the pandemic. Unfortunately, though, there's still not agreed upon taxonomy for what green includes when it comes to investments. But fortunately, China took an important step forward when the PBOC agreed in June 2020 to exclude clean coal from qualifying as a green investment. While green finance development has indeed been robust, China still has significant challenges ahead in making the necessary adjustments of its economy to reach carbon neutrality. But given China's innovative spirit, as we've seen with green finance product innovation like green credit, green funds, green insurance, and green fintech, it's hard to bet against China reaching its goals. As the host this year of the CBD COP15, China will have an opportunity to once again show leadership, as it did when serving as a catalyst for green finance with the G20. The biodiversity challenge is urgent. With tropical forests in retreat and the extinction of species thought to be about 1,000 times the natural rate, nature's ability to provide the goods and services on which we depend is being undermined, presenting enormous risks to prosperity. The Paulson Institute, along with our partners, the Nature Conservancy and Cornell University, published a report last year focusing on financing biodiversity conservation, and a China-specific report will be released later this year to try and strengthen this message in advance of the CBD COP. Our report revealed that biodiversity financing gap, estimated at up to $125 billion per year over the next 10 years, is significant, obviously, but not insurmountable, and can be bridged by implementing sensible and viable strategies. As governments look to craft post-pandemic economic recovery policies, it's more important than ever to incorporate these biodiversity challenges into building back better. Harnessing the power of markets can protect our environment and prevent its rapid destruction. In financial terms, bats, bees, and birds are a valuable asset. Take, for example, the service provided by pollinators, essential to grow fruits, nuts, and vegetables, that are dying in record numbers. A total loss of these species could lead to a drop in annual agricultural output of more than $200 billion. Add the secondary service of pollinating non-food crops, such as alfalfa, the main feed for cattle, and the impact rises to more than $500 billion a year. And another real-world example. During the 1990s in New York, city officials were discussing creating an $8 billion filtration plant to provide clean water to the city. One smart worker determined that instead, maybe it would be cheaper just to stop destroying the watershed that historically had cleaned New York City's water. Instead, they spent just $1.5 billion, modest in comparison to the $8 billion, encouraging farmers to use organic products and move animals away from the streams, revamped the city's sewage infrastructure, and instituted conservation agreements in the Catskills watershed. Today, arguably, New York City has the best tasting water in the United States. As for China, while their green finance experiment is still ongoing, there are plenty of lessons that China can draw upon to tackle biodiversity loss and pricing natural resources. Beyond elevating the urgency attached to biodiversity globally with its hosting of the CBD COP15, China can use its experiences in green finance, including with the carbon markets, its pilot zones, and creating new financial innovative products to play a leading role at the nexus of biodiversity and finance. This intersection is novel and emerging, just as green finance was a few short years ago. But none of this will happen overnight. But having seen the growth of finance, green finance, there's much that can be done with the right combination of political will, good government policy, and innovative financing. Our hopes are with China and being a leader in this field. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. I have full confidence that the conversation today will be engaging, productive, and thought-provoking with such a high caliber of panelists and all of you joining us. Many thanks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Gallagher from Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. I'm sorry I couldn't be with everyone in person and would really like to be part of the conversation in general, but glad I could be here at least in this capacity. My presentation is called Linking Development Finance with Biodiversity Goals. I will make 4 points. First, China's overseas development finance is now at the same scale as the World Bank. It's monstrous at close to $500 billion around the world. Number two, that China's overseas development finance is large and poses significant risks to biodiversity and nature. Three, China has strong domestic policies that could be extended to overseas finance on biodiversity. And I'll share with you some recommendations that I made as the co-chair of the China Council on International Cooperation for Environment and Development, which is out of the Ministry of Environment in China, on how the BRI could be greened for SDG 15 and the Convention on Biological Diversity. And then I'll also talk about some new possibilities. The work I'm going to talk about today comes out of two different entities, not just all by myself by any stretch of the imagination. First, as I said, I co-chair with Zhou Guomei and Qi Yulong from the Ministry of Environment in China, Ministry of Ecology and Environment, the Greening the BRI Task Force. And we just released a new report on SDG 15 and the BRI, which I have, if you look at the link at the bottom of the PowerPoint presentation here, www.bu.edu/GDP, you can find that report. It's called the SPS report. Secondly, I'm just going to share with you some research that our Global China Initiative Biodiversity and Indigenous Rights team at the Global Development Policy Center has been engaged with, and these are the friends and faces of some of the folks on that team. Before I begin and get really into these 4 points, I think it's always important to understand that the Belt Road Initiative has incredible potential. In fact, it may even be the highest potential regional integration program on offer. The World Bank came out with a report in 2019 that I recommend that folks look at. It's called Belt Road Economics. And they showed that the BRI could increase trade in BRI countries by 9.7% and FDI by 7.6%. It could increase the GDP or the incomes for BRI countries by 3.4% and for 2.9% for countries outside of the BRI, just because of the linkages that will happen. The same group did similar modeling for the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that a lot of folks are talking about now. And the benefits of the BRI could be up to 3 times larger than the TPP and are likely underestimates. We've just come out with a new data set, which I encourage you to go to our webpage and take a look at because it's interactive. You can look at Chinese overseas development finance, and you can look at its proximity to indigenous lands and to biodiversity. As I noted before, it's a spatially located data set, shows 859 projects in 93 countries that have both been verified and mapped in a spatially located manner. And there's 464 billion of them across the world, about the same as much as the World Bank is engaged in across the world at the same time period, which is 2008 till 2019. What's interesting is that about 62% of it just goes to 10 countries. They're shown here: Ecuador, Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, Iran, Pakistan, etc. Indonesia, also important biodiversity country. What do the finance go into? It's largely transportation, extraction and related pipelines, and electric power. Some government services and manufacturing, but those 3 infrastructure related sectors are where most of the action is. What we've done is try to examine what the socio-ecological risks are. First, in terms of biodiversity risk, to what extent are these projects in proximity to threatened species richness, to protected areas, and to critical habitats? And also with respect to indigenous lands near those biodiversity hotspots. Here are some of our results. The biodiversity bubbles on this map are going to be those that are closer to bluish purple, and the ones that are more indigenous risk are going to be the ones closer to red, and ones that cross the others, say a highly biodiverse area in Ecuador that also has a lot of indigenous peoples in that biodiverse area, that one will be purple. Overall, the risks tend to be highest in northern sub-Saharan Africa and South and Southeast Asia. We also have another measure called maximum risk. So what I showed in the last slide was overall risk. Overall, is the project generally close to a biodiverse area or indigenous lands? But we have another measure called maximum risk, which is often used in the literature, which examines the extent to which one point of it might be really somewhere that's of concern. This is what maximum risk looks like. Again, same color scheme, and generally some of the same sets of countries. We add Ethiopia, Namibia, Mongolia, very concerning from a biodiversity standpoint. In our CCI-CED group, so what do we do about this? How can China make sure that this international integration program with incredible economic potential in a period in COVID crisis where we're facing a biggest economic downturn since the Great Depression, where we want to get new finance, we want to get economic growth, but of course we also want to make sure that A, it does no harm with respect to biodiversity and nature, and even better, if it could build back better and actually improve outcomes. In our CCI-CED task force, we focused a little bit more on the do no harm part. And one of the interesting things on our team, we looked at international best practices, and on the China team, they looked at Chinese law and Chinese practices. And there's very interesting parallels between China's pioneering ecological redlining approach and the mitigation hierarchy, which you find across many other international development finance institutions. That was one finding in our report, and again, I hope you'll take a look at the larger thing, that led us to come to these recommendations that we officially made to the State Council of China. Number one at the CBD, when it happens, is to officially announce and implement aligning BRI projects with SDG 15 and the CBD. Number two, to create mechanisms that mainstream biodiversity screening throughout the BRI project cycle. Three, to adapt the ecological redlining, especially with respect to mitigation hierarchies and so forth, throughout that screening and implementation period. Fourth, we recommended that a mitigation hierarchy with Chinese characteristics be a core part of the BRI, as well as strategic environmental assessments for each project, which are currently now relying on host countries to provide that information. Sometimes those host countries don't have those systems. Sometimes they put them by the wayside. And fourth, to establish a governance structure to make sure this is built in throughout the project cycle, and finance mechanisms for compensation and things like of that nature. So these were our official recommendations to the State Council in China, and I feel pretty optimistic that some form of some of these will be part of the CBD package as China hosts it later on. Just want to bring up, right before I go, a couple other things that that could be brought into the toolkit for the Belt Road Initiative. Of course, right now, the world is in debt distress because of the COVID crisis and the associated economic crisis. Countries are having trouble paying their dollar-denominated debts, and most, if not all, BRI financing is in dollars, and countries are squeezed on it. The G20's created something called the DSSI, and China's been the most active participant in suspending payments for China, for its debtors until things get a little bit better. there's been an increasing movement in the G20 to also move to relief on the net present value of the actual financing. And doing debt for nature swaps could be part of those bilateral efforts. And as the multilateral system starts to talk about comprehensive debt relief, I've been part of another project called the Debt Relief for a Green Recovery Effort, which argues that nature performance, climate change performance should be a core part of such a thing. Also, moving forward with new finance, China should create a biodiversity fund similar to the fund that they have on climate change. It could be used to invest in biodiversity on BRI countries. It could be used for these compensation mechanisms through a mitigation hierarchy. It could also be used as part of debt for climate swaps and debt for nature swaps. But to be really pioneering, let's remember that China was the real pioneer when it came to green bonds. And they really launched a number of incredible issuances that have led to some significant clean energy in particular. China could also be a pioneer in nature performance bonds for the Chinese markets and for the BRI. I encourage folks to look at F4B's technical note on nature performance bonds. And I think it would be great during the Q&A, I wish I could be there, on the extent to which those could be incorporated into the Chinese market. I want to thank everybody. We're having a webinar ourselves on February 3rd, 9:30 to 10:30 a.m. EST on China, the overseas debt situation, and the extent to which debt relief in dealing with the debt crisis and recovery can be linked to nature and biodiversity. We have an article in Science coming out on January 29th that this will largely be based on, but we'll be joined by ecologists in Ecuador and Shuang Lu from the World Resources Institute's China team. Thanks so much.
And thank you to Kevin and to Deborah for these excellent introductions. I'm Isabel Hilton. I'm the founder and chief advisor of China Dialogue, and we are joined in this joint webinar with F4B by a fantastic panel to discuss some key points that we've just heard about, both on the risks and opportunities of finance for biodiversity, some sobering data there on BRI, and pointers to the potential way ahead. But how to make that happen? Well, we'll be picking up on a lot of those thoughts in the discussion. A couple of points just before I introduce the panel. The panelists have kindly agreed to give us some extra minutes, so we expect, if you can stay with us to finish this webinar 50 minutes longer than advertised, so 10:15 GMT. Please put your questions in the Q&A and we'll answer as many as we can. And now I'm delighted to introduce our panel. First of all, Ma Jun, the celebrated founder and director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, who has pioneered the collection and the use of data in environmental and business decision-making for more than 15 years. We're joined also by Marianne Haahr. Marianne is Executive Director at Green Digital Finance Alliance, and prior to that was an advisor to the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Denmark on digitization and emerging markets finance. Bernice is the founding director of the Hoffmann Center for Sustainable Resource Economy and research director of Futures at Chatham House here in London. And Dr. Christoph Nedopil Wang is the founding director of the IIGF Green Belt and Road Initiative Center, and he's a senior research fellow at the Central University of Finance and Economics in Beijing and a lecturer at Rennes and at the Sorbonne. So we have a terrific panel. Christoph, I'd like to start with you, if I may. As we heard Deborah outline there, we've seen a growing awareness in financial systems of climate risk and of finance for the energy transition, and that's really moving along. But biodiversity remains relatively neglected in finance. Why is that? Why is financing nature different? Once the green consciousness has taken hold, shouldn't it also be on the list?
Thank you so much, Isabel. I hope you can hear me. That's also a great panel. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I also just saw some of the distinguished participants actually that are listening in here. So it's fantastic to be speaking here. And I think there are many people who are trying to integrate the biodiversity thoughts into the green financial system. As you say correctly, I think kind of the green finance system, particularly in China, came really out of the idea, how can we deal with air pollution particularly? So that's, we heard before also from Deborah that clean coal was originally part of the green bond catalog in China, and is still part of the green industry catalog in China. That is really kind of coming from the idea reducing pollution. And then kind of we're moving particularly also in China in the direction of integrating climate considerations. Now with climate considerations, I think we're all quite aware that one of the most important measures to evaluate climate risks or climate impacts is CO2 emissions, or the equivalent of CO2 emissions. The big question for biodiversity is, do we have a similar measure to either understand the impact that specific projects or industries have on biodiversity? So what is a good measure to understand the output, the risk that specific activities have on biodiversity? So there's a lot of work going on around this, also through the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. And then it also kind of comes to, it's a dual question. We also don't necessarily understand what are the risks that specific projects are facing if we have biodiversity loss. We understand it more or less on an industry level. So also Deborah was speaking about the risks to specific industries if we don't have pollination anymore. Now that's, I think, very increasingly understood what the risks are for an industry, but for an individual financial decision maker or for an individual financial institution, it's really the question, how do we understand, evaluate the risk of a specific investment if biodiversity is reduced? So it's really a question of an understanding of the indicators to measure biodiversity risks that the financial sector is right now working on.
Christoph, thank you. So as we've heard, and Kevin referenced, China is emerging from this very destructive decade of development, many benefits delivered, but also terrible damage, and a systemic problem. How do you turn that system around? So turning to green finance and the initiatives we've heard about, but Majun, in this field, we've seen a lot of discussion, a lot of promises, a lot of talk. If you look at the objectives of the CBD, the IT targets, pretty much all of them missed. If you look at what's happening now, and increasingly you're the master of this large volume of data which can be deployed to address some of the questions that Christoph has raised, do you see real movement here? And how do we tell what's real and what isn't greenwashing? Tell us what you observe from where you sit now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and so glad to join this this panel discussion. And I agree with the insights of all the experts expressed, and except that recognition to Majun. You know, I will pass to him, and we're going to have two meetings with his team later this week. So it just shows how, you know, how important his role is, you know, in China's green finance drive. You know, China's green finance policy started more than 10 years ago by the then Vice Minister Pan Yue, but that hasn't gone very far, because at that time, you know, the whole country still put GDP growth rate ahead of environmental protection. But then, you know, as Christoph mentioned about this whole air pollution problem, the smog problem, have helped to change mobilize the people, and they make voice, and the government lended ear to that and started measuring and disclosing PM 2.5, and people understand how bad it is, how much health impact this could have. So they have the government to create action plans to deal with the air pollution, and then water, and then soil and now ocean and new chemicals, all this. But the government, there's a top-down way of administrative way of doing that, but there's also a market approach. 2016, 7 ministries coming together to publish this new, initiate this new round of green finance. And then we have the Green Finance Committee funded by the other Majun. And we're lucky to be a member of that. And we have been invited because of our data. If you want to have a market-based solution, then you need to have data. You need to be able to measure, and you need to be able to differentiate. You need to be able to provide dynamic assessment. So, in response to the demand from the financial institutions, we, now based on our data, developed a dynamic environmental credit assessment tool, which is based on some more than nearly 2 million records of violations among these millions of factories. So we're tracking millions of companies. And also every day, 3 million emission data we collected, and 500,000 air and water data we collected every day. And based on that, we developed this dynamic tool. And now, during the pandemic, we helped one of the largest banks in China, a state-owned bank, to run through 70,000 companies who want to borrow money from them. This is the different scale that that the data can help to motivate. But of course, it started from local pollution control, because that's the most, at this moment, most pressing issue. But President Xi's commitment, pledge made, have changed the whole dynamic just fairly recently. Now, this is very important because China, after adopting the toughest environmental policy for 4 or 5 years, now experience economic slowdown and then the hit of the pandemic. So the local government want to relax control, and they want to, some of them want to go back to the old way. We see China's crude steel surpass 10 billion tons for the first time last year, even with the pandemic. And then you can imagine, along with that, a vast, a significant rebound of energy consumption and carbon emission. So this pledge made by President Xi came at a very vital moment.
That's
out of a lot of
2060.
2030 to peak, and then 2060 to neutralize carbon neutrality. I think this is extremely important. Now the 14th five-year plan made in China have integrated quite some of this climate target. But then, biodiversity, this should be the next climate, basically. But so far, in China, we have been suffering from so much damage. Some progress have been made, but talking about freshwater biodiversity, the Yangtze River alone now have seen the fish egg and young fish, the volume dropped by 90%. So it's impoverished, of fish. So we issued a 10-year fishing ban over the Yangtze River, but that's not enough. And then, with all this logging ban and the protection of all the expansion of protective zones, it also increased the demand from Chinese companies to try to take resource from other part of the world. So we will see a rippling off or implications. So we have to do more on that, and we are developing a biodiversity map database. I can go to more details later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And so important progress, but not enough, not fast enough. The situation is pretty dire. But I think it's very helpful, as you've explained, that to the the problem that Christoph referenced of how an individual investor makes a decision. Your data is helping that investor avoid risk because you have mapped so much risk, so many violators over the years, and this huge volume of data is very important. Marianne, though, I'd like to begin to explore with you, other than avoiding risk, there needs to be a positive story. And again, we come back to the question of how do you verify, how do you measure, how do you make these decisions? You are deeply involved with fintech, with new developments, and the association of again, large volumes of data with decision making. Just explain to us how this can help. What can we do with this?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think I would like to link this to what we heard from Christoph, where he talks about that we know about sector risks. We are pretty clear on the biodiversity sector risk level, but what we need now to step into is also to understand the risks at the specific financial service institution level. So for them to be able to make biodiversity commitments. So just that we have now best practice starting to be net zero carbon commitments by FIs, what sort of would be the equivalent for biodiversity, and the one you could start with could be a net zero deforestation commitment for FIs, right? But currently, that would be very difficult to get any FI to do that unless you're a very local FI with a very local value chain, because of the fact that you just do not have the data trail of what is the deforestation in all of your clients' portfolios. But what we are seeing in China currently is digitization of finance extremely rapidly, right? Where China launched what's called the Business Services Network of April last year, which is one of the world's largest blockchain trading platforms. It has 8 overseas nodes. So quite a lot of going forward, quite a lot of the countries that want to trade with China will do that on this blockchain platform. So China could start to build in that green data layer on the deforestation risks in all the commodities going into China. So we have a perfect moment actually, because China just changed its forestry law, which prohibits import of timber that where if you know that it's illegally logged. So you could now just look at the smart contract of that timber at the port of China. And then when you click on that smart contract, you could get a digital map of where that timber is logged, whether it's logged in one of the red zones globally, whether it's from a protected area. You could get the source of origin information. So we would actually get the geolocation of that imported timber. So a bank could actually link their clients' transactions to deforestation, real deforestations, not only risks. So you could overlay it with satellite data, etc. And that would actually pave the way for FIs being able to set net zero deforestation targets. And it could place China in a new type of sort of taking green finance to the next level. What they did with G20 and what they have done in the green bonds market, they could move in and say, well, we are going to give this large digital infrastructure, the Business Services Network, a clear biodiversity finance or green finance job description, and then be the one that convenes the world around this. So that's one specific example.
Thank you, and lots of again, lots of very promising initiatives there. But Bernice, from where you sit, and as we look at COP15 and as we look at all those missed Aichi targets, do you see the movement that we've heard discussed so far? Do you see that as strong enough to make a real contribution?
Well, thank you very much, Isabel, this morning, and thank you so far to all the other panelists for this extremely rich discussion so far already. And I think that, I think I'm going to have some kind of quite disappointing remarks to make in some ways, because I feel that in some ways, while we are hearing a lot of excellent ideas and progress, and indeed we are beginning to move from risk management and disclosure into more positive financing, the reality is that we're not really connected and not really connecting enough all the different pieces that we've heard today, which there are many, from data and metrics from Marianne, from obviously all the risk side from Christoph, from Kevin talking about the connection between BRI and debt, and of course Marianne now looking at much more positively, how do we use a positive discussion of potential positive impact and connecting it to finance. So while it is very encouraging to see many blossoming ideas, initiatives, targets, and aspirations around financing for nature, and as I said, the reality is not connecting and it's not connected. And the question is, how do we make sure that all these financing ideas are really grounded in the reality of specific place-based implementation of the sort that Marianne also described as well, and Kevin too, on the ecological redlining, for example. And that actually means that we need to make sure that all of the financing systems would help deliver all the associated public goods, whether it's mitigation, adaptation on climate, biodiversity protection, food security, as well as in the longer term, connecting it to questions around regenerative agriculture and the bio-based economy as well. But of course, as we know, the danger at the moment is that a lot of the nature-based solutions and associated financial mechanisms are seen as silver bullets or get out of jail free cards for large emitters. But the good news is that with the opportunity that we see today from a combination of COVID, rebuilding the economy afterwards, the blossom of green finance, but also all these symmetry that you mentioned, Isabel, just now, that we actually have a chance not just to look at the specific, but also using this to reset the nature, so-called nature economy, the natural capital accounting discussion. And we are seeing now quite a lot of positive signs from China and beyond. Look at how do we really input these in land use and land use planning in such a way that we are really emphasizing the integrity of policies and commitments and the importance of connecting these international, national, local processes to other forms of, MRV process, monitoring, reporting, verification processes, and supply chain management in such a way that actually really help us to connect the pieces. And I think that it is very easy, as always, as you know, to dismiss examples from China as unreplicable, including those of ecological redlining. I saw the question just now about whether it works or not, because of the unique nature and the scale of obviously the country. But I think the reality is that with many of the nature pieces and the place-based nature of many of the pieces, we are talking about whether we're talking in the terms of nature-based solutions, natural climate solutions, etc. The reality is that lessons learning from all the different components and lessons and good ideas are always going to be challenging. So then, therefore, what we need to do is to really figure out how do we connect the dots, but also create this sort of centrifugal forces that we were expecting this year to develop, to come up with Kunming, COP15 and COP26. Now, I thought it was very interesting. I've been calling it Zunga, the Zoom edition of the UN General Assembly. The Zunga commitment by President Xi is one such centrifugal force. Now, obviously, COVID is making it much, much harder for leadership from Kunming and also Glasgow to really drive a lot of these in a way that we hope we would see. So what that really leaves us really is that if things are not connecting because they just simply do because of the natural forces and forcing dynamic around summit, it means that all the different actors in the ecosystem have to do their own bit in connecting the pieces in a way. And if I may maybe end this, Isabel, with a dream that we talked about the other day when we were preparing for this meeting. I mean, listening to Marianne, which I found extremely inspiring, which is to obviously, we have been talking about the promises of blockchain for a very long time. We have also been talking a lot about the problematic nature of the large size of the Chinese state-run economy. And I recently saw some number, I think, from Jagonomics actually talking about how if you look at the state-owned sector in China is something like 4% of the global economy. And then if you combine what Kevin said as well earlier about the size of Chinese overseas development finance, this actually means that we have a huge possibility around using these numbers to drive through, for example, data metrics and blockchain, for example, the functioning of a nature-based economy in a very different way. So my dream that I haven't really proposed enough in public is that if indeed there is such a large sizable Chinese state-owned sector on one level, and on another, the government is in a position, in some sense, to mandate some of the spending, including through public sector pay, and suggest that, say 20% of public sector pay in China could be, which should only be redeemable, for example, via nature-based economy. For example, it could be any form of sustainable economy. I'm not fussy. It could be anything from sustainable biofuels for, let's say, aviation, to good detergent, etc. I don't really care. But the point is that we can create a system where we use the state-owned nature of the Chinese economy to the advantage of the promotion of the green economy. And I will end there. Thank you.
It's great to have a radical proposition, excuse me, put. I just want to pick up on a few things that have come up so far. And I think this joining up of systems is a key one. Christoph, we've seen these innovations in the domestic economy in China, in lots of green finance, green bonds. We talked about it. Belt and Road. Remember Kevin's charts there. Where does the money actually go on Belt and Road? This is a nature destroying machine, not at the moment either a conserving or a rebuilding machine. What are the chances of moving that good impulse, those innovative ideas from the domestic economy into China's overseas investments and making them a positive biodiversity force financially?
Wow, that's a very, very difficult question, and a very good question. So I think Kevin's presentation was very clear kind of about some of the risks that biodiversity, the BRI projects have for biodiversity. Also, WWF came out with a really fantastic study on the biodiversity risk and the hotspots that are some of the corridors and the projects of the BRI are touching or crossing. There is several initiatives as part of the Belt and Road Initiative Green Coalition under the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, where we are also working a lot with, that tries to wrap their head around kind of, first of all, how do we do, for example, redlining, as Kevin also just mentioned. That means how do we ensure that we're not investing anywhere close to biodiversity hotspots. So this is should be almost like an obvious solution, but it's at the moment still not 100% implemented. So we're still seeing various roads or other linear infrastructure cutting through also virgin rainforest in the BRI, be it in Congo or in Southeast Asia. So there is a need to understand, first of all, kind of how can we apply some of this redlining that is applied in China also to BRI projects. Now, the big challenge is, of course, who's overseeing that? Who's responsible for making sure that either the developers or the financial institutions are not investing in building projects that are destroying biodiversity? Is it the host countries, which are often also not strong enough, where institutions are potentially not strong enough, the governance system is not strong enough, the execution is not strong enough? Or is it then the Chinese investors? Now, China is, of course, very much believing in the host country principle, that we are not telling other countries what they should do, how they should implement a project. If they want to implement it in a specific way, then it's not our responsibility, and we are doing this. So I think there's a lot, particularly for cross-border investment. We're very far away to be able to really include biodiversity through regulation into the decision-making process. Now, there are initiatives, as I said, and there's also the Green Development Guidance, which was published by the MEE, where I had the honor to lead a lot of the work, that for the first time really includes biodiversity consideration as a environmental risk, and where we developed this traffic light system that allows for all types of projects to be evaluated according to their pollution risk, their climate risk, and their biodiversity risk. So investors can more easily understand whether they have any environmental risk exposure. So I think this is a good good development. But again, the real big question is, Kevin Rudd wrote actually in China Dialogue about that, is the big question: how can this traffic light system be implemented and ensured? So I think there's a lot of questions still that need to be answered, both for the investors, for the EPCs, and also for the host countries in order to protect biodiversity.
Great, thank you, Christoph. Just picking up on that, Marianne, you've spent many years pushing boundaries of data and pushing and seeing attitudes change. I mean, when you started IPE, it was, all develop first, clean up later, and you've seen those what looked like fundamental attitudes within the policy making community in China shift. This question of it's the host country who decides, which of course, it's a more complicated reality than that. China is very big. It makes big offers. Sometimes the choices on the table are limited, and sometimes host countries, as we've heard, don't actually have the data to inform the kind of decision. Can you see your methodology, the work that you've done for so many years in China, being applicable internationally for China's overseas investments, for example?
Yes, definitely. We used to stick to this host country decide policy, and but then we realized that that no longer we can hide behind that, because our sheer scale of our economy and of our influence, and as the investor, project investor, and financier, and also sometimes builder and operator, we realize that we have the responsibility, not just the moral responsibility, but in many cases, they have been burned pretty badly, because they failed when we move outside China, operate outside China. When you fail to consider all this environmental, social issues, climate issues, I mean, sometimes you suffer from huge economic losses. And so many of them started growing this awareness that they want to do something different. Those who have been operating outside, and those who kind of provide finance for this, banking service for this, they also want to access the information. But as said, it's very, very difficult to access this information. So I think now, I'm glad to see that over the past 2-3 years, we have been invited to visit countries like Vietnam, like India, like other countries. They express their interest, not just to learn the lessons in China, but also some of the solutions developed here. For example, recently during the pandemic, we have to have Zoom meeting, but the Vietnamese government is very interested, and NGOs are extremely interested in the real-time monitoring technology China has rolled out for the first time in the world. Now, about tens of thousands of largest emitters, we have their data every hour or every 2 hours, and this is what we can do, and this helped to bring some of the financial service that started, for the first time. I think only from last year we started seeing the green finance really more kind of materialized. I think they really approach us, and some of them started adopting our color coding system, 4 colors, and if it is falling into the red or deep yellow, then they will force them to first go through process to solve their problem before they can get access to the loans. And but on the biodiversity side, so far it's still quite difficult. I look at I browsed through some of the questions. I think Eugene raised one question about redlining. I think others raised this question. China has designated a quarter of its territory to redline zones, but now so far, as said, the maps are not quite accessible. What we are doing is to put it on the digital map at this moment, including all the sensitive regions and also the all these protected zones, national parks, although, because of all this mapping, policy, data policy in China, we won't publish, before the government publish more detailed maps, but we can calculate all of this. We can overlay that with more than 4 million companies we put on the digital map. So with this, we can start calculating their biodiversity, their footprint. And I hope that, we can do this in China, but I hope that eventually we can also have this in other parts of the world. And with that, it will be so much more easier for the banks and financial institutions to try to do that. And at this moment, I think another question raised about all this soybeans and palm oil and all of this. I think China is importing so much of that, and very much of that is for our own consumption, for instant noodles and all kind of things. But many other parts are also, China is the factory of the world. We import and process and re-export.
Yeah.
So all these major brands, now more than nearly 600 of them, we're tracking their supply chain performance. And I think there's a chance to also integrate that into the green supply chain. The last point I want to make is, let's come together to make a database for BRI and or for more kind of global resource access. Thank you.
Excellent proposal. Bernice, you want to come in here?
Yeah, very quickly, I just want to support what Dr. Marianne had just said as well, that I think that we talked about the centrifugal force that could help connect the piece. And there's no question in my mind, and my friend Guido Schmidt-Schraub will be very happy with me for saying this, the digital map indeed is one of the solutions. And it's, again, I would love to hear more from Marianne about what she thinks in terms of the privacy and other considerations when it comes to the digitalization of such commitments and connection to positive benefits. Because I think that this could indeed be one of the pieces that help connect the dots, that connect the risk exposure piece with the positive contribution piece, but also commitment to finance.
Marianne, do you want to pick up that challenge? There's a question of transferability of lessons is one thing, but also very different approaches to data privacy questions. Might be instructive to look at how the EU handles the same question. Is it possible to get over these differences and take up Marjun's suggestion of a joint database? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely think that there are opportunities and avenues that China can choose. And I agree with Bernice and Marjun that if China can bring some of the data capabilities, because it's one of the countries which has most data, basically, right? Sitting that can be either converted to biodiversity or which can be leveraged for innovation for biodiversity. So if we look at the GDPR, so in which is the data regulation in the European Union, what that does is that it gives end users, not ownership of their data, but the right to control how that data is used, so that you are always asked before it is used it's sold on to companies. So it's not an ownership right; it's a control right. And I think that control right is we're seeing data privacy laws also now transferred to other jurisdictions. So I think for China, we also see that this is a conversation that is picking up about how to manage this. And I think specifically when we talk about sort of new types of data infrastructure, so the back end, if we talk about that being blockchain rather than the existing internet protocols where the databases are centralized, so your data is owned by one company. If it's decentralized, such as in the BSN, or if we build the database that Marjun is talking about of the BRI and greening of BRI on a decentralized infrastructure such as BSN or others, then it's totally possible, or it's built into the technology, that you have a localized wallet. So it is a network where you as a user can control with your private key what data sets are used and what data sets are viewed by whom. So it delegates that type of control to you. So I think that if we use that type of smart infrastructure, then that's possible. I think for quite a number of the large tech companies in China, we work closely with Ant Financial, for instance. There is definitely a movement towards opening up parts of the data and also of incorporating practices which has some resemblance to the GDPR. So for instance, on the Ant Forest application, you are asked before you share any type of data or before your data is used to convert it into a carbon footprint real time on your behaviors, for instance. You are asked, so you, in a sense, control it, even though it's not sort of a regulatory requirement. But that is where the world is moving. And I think those large Chinese companies that want to globalize and attract international investors, they know that they need to move in that direction of some sort of data control right at the user end.
Great, thank you. We've been touching on a lot of issues that have been raised in the questions. Christoph, there's a question here from Terry Townsend, specifically over COP15, hosted by China, as we know. What can financiers reasonably expect from Kunming in terms of helping to ensure biodiversity risk is integrated into investment and lending, and how to ensure that finance ministers are at the center of these discussions?
I think that's a very good question. Again, we're working hard on, I think there are several, both ministries in China, the MEE is of course in the lead to organize the Biodiversity COP, and biodiversity finance is supposed to play a strong part in it. There are several side events that are being organized also by relevant institutions to address kind of the idea of biodiversity finance, where we are also involved. I think there's, I think the expectations are high, should be high. I think the motivation of China to really mobilize capital for the conservation of biodiversity is high. There's, everybody kind of talks about the Paris Agreement for climate, and it would be a wonderful achievement for China as well to make sure that the Kunming Agreement or something similar has a similar ring to it. I would say, apart from the finance ministers, we really have to make sure that the central bankers are actually involved in there. And we are seeing some important movement of central banks to understand the loss, the biodiversity risks that have a macro-prudential risk for them. So similar to the climate risks, where central bankers are now understanding that climate risks are actually a systemic risk, and therefore the financial institutions that the central banks are regulating, the central banks are regulating in many ways the financial institutions, and there's often also the banking regulator, that they are integrated into the biodiversity finance and biodiversity risk discussions, because they set the tone. They make sure that the financial institutions have to either disclose risk, that they're getting preferential treatments, for example, for investing in biodiversity. So in China, we have the central bank that allows for financial institutions that invest more of their assets in green bonds, for example, to have a lower refinancing rate. Now, if you have a lower refinancing rate for your financial institutions because you invest in green, the idea is, of course, you invest more in green because it's becoming more valuable than investing in brown. So setting the right incentives for financial institutions, not necessarily only through the ministries of finance, but also through the central banks and the banking regulators, is hugely important for financial institutions to really integrate the risks. And I kind of, to that point, since we always talk about we need more biodiversity finance, I really want to stress we don't need necessarily more finance. We have so much finance. We have more finance than ever before. We have to stop financing the wrong things. So it's really important not to only say we need more finance, more finance, more finance. As long as we're destroying and trying to rebuild, it's a futile effort. What we have to do is to increase the cost for brown finance, increase the cost for deforestation. So ensure that the financial institutions or the financial institutions are not supporting any projects that are actually detrimental to biodiversity, that are accelerating biodiversity loss. So this is really, really the challenge that we have to face. It's not, again, about mobilizing more capital. It's about shifting the capital away from the destroying finance to a nature positive development.
Absolutely. And I just wanted maybe to pull back and pick up again on something that Kevin referenced, which is debt and the possibility of, well, I'd like to bundle two things. One is COVID recovery packages, which are not as green as they should be so far. And the question of debt for nature, which I seem to remember from the 80s didn't really thrive. Perhaps it will do better this time around. Marianne, how do you see that? Is debt for nature is this a promising moment, a way of changing our big habits?
I mean, sovereign debt is quite a large portion of international capital markets, right? So if we can manage to green that and make that nature sensitive, so we can actually get nature into to sovereign budgets, then we have come quite a far way. But I think the thinking has matured since the 80s, that now we would like to have them more as nature swaps in nature performance bonds type structures. So where you put in more accountability, both to those that actually participate, but also to your populations of actually your behavior is rewarded according to or you get relief according to your behavioral changes, right? And I think that China has a really opportunity again to leverage its front runner position in digital technology to make the monitoring and validation, give parts of that task to technology. We saw last year that one of the largest banks in China issued a blockchain-based bond for SME financing. And that was exactly to automate part of the data collection, to make it transparent, to make it fast and efficient. And we could do that as well with a nature performance bond, make one that is technologically smart, and where it can be more transparent, the performance metrics that are put into the to the agreement. So I think that would be one thing that China could launch at the CBD.
So we seem to be on the threshold of some very exciting things. But again, let's be aware of obstacles. There was a question of which I noticed in the Q&A, which reminded us that European rules restrict the sharing of some kinds of data. And the questioner wanted to know from Majun whether there were Chinese data sources or Chinese databases which couldn't be shared outside China or with particular institutions. Is this are obstacles to data sharing a difficulty that you foresee in your efforts to make these accountability systems more universal?
It is, yeah, I have to acknowledge that. And so with that, I truly share what the concern, raised by Bernice, and also, Marianne touched upon this issue. But what Marianne is talking about, this new technology, have the potential to provide solutions for some of this. There are this, the blockchain is obviously a huge kind of it's a very, very big innovative solution. At this moment, we still haven't been able to fully adopt that, but to quite adopt that, we developed something called the eco chain, which also helped to link different stakeholders together. And during the process, try to, there are new technologies emerging that you can use the data for process, for all kind of your needs, but you may not actually access some of the data. I think this type of technology may be eventually very, very helpful, because we have some of the data considered to be sensitive. For example, all this millions of companies in China, factories, projects, and the geolocation data. Sometimes some of the project might be considered to be security or some other reason for sensitivities. I think in other countries there might be similar concerns. So with those, there are legitimate reasons behind that. So we have to be very, very careful in handling all of this. But I'm confident that the new technologies developed could help us to overcome all this privacy and also the rights of the data could also be an issue eventually. So all of this, I hope that we can, this should not stop us from exploring a more universal data availability.
Thank you. Christoph, I just wanted to pick up on one question, which was about the risks posed to biodiversity by monocultures, and how green finance can prevent the biodiversity loss associated with agricultural practice. Is that something that you see as very present in Chinese thinking at the moment?
I think actually Martin would be more able to answer the question on monocultures. So I would like to
You're going to defer.
Send the question to him.
We're working you too hard. A very quick answer, please, on monoculture, because we're coming to the end.
Okay, monoculture is having a big impact on biodiversity. In China, even some of the reforestation projects, have caused so much trouble. The poplar trees in the northwest, and then the eucalyptus trees in the southwestern part of China have caused so much damage. And in the
hasn't got far enough.
Yeah, that's right. And in I think Malaysia, Indonesia, and then we have in the Amazon, all this monoculture could have a huge impact. I think with that, I'm glad, at this moment we're working with a group of Chinese real estate developers who have sourced so much timber outside China. And now, one of the ways is to get certified timbers service. Otherwise, they will not be rated green. So I hope that we can develop more system like that.
With great regret, we're coming very rapidly to the end of our extended time. I'm going to ask each of you to give a very short answer to what you most hope to see from COP15 and what the chances are. Christoph.
It's a hard one.
It's got to be brief.
Two things. Debt for nature swaps, I think we're all working on that. I think there's a lot of need for it because it provides a lot of double benefit of creating jobs, or triple benefit, creating jobs, relieving the debt burden, and protecting the nature. And of course, a more financial framework to include the risks that can include a lot of data, but also a broader international understanding how to include financial risk or biodiversity risk into financial decision making.
Marianne,
thank you.
15 seconds. Thank you, Christoph.
I agree with the one of the comments in the chat box that we hope to see a specific target on the financial sector in the CBD, and that it moves out of a fundraising role, so catalyzing more capital into nature. But just as Christoph said, that it's about aligning all financial allocations with the needs of nature, so incorporating nature metrics into financial decision making. And then with Marjun, that on the back of the CBD, we will get this global database and global data collaboration around some of the most exposed, starting with deforestation, I would propose.
Bernice, you've told us your dream. Do you have one wish for CBD?
Yes, I think there will be public sector finance related announcement from CBD, and I would very much like to see that as a catalyzing force that could drive some of the connection of the dots. Because if this meeting confirmed one thing to me, Isabel, is the fact that there are many dots that we are yet to connect properly. So I hope very much that that kind of announcement along the type that my co-panelists also mentioned will help drive the connection of the dots. Thank you.
Marjun, for you, is it the database?
Yes, it is the database, which can hold them accountable, the big business and the bank's investors, but also in the meantime, enable and empower them to go green.
We could, of course, continue, but we have to call it a day. My huge thanks to you wonderful panelists, to Marianne, to Christoph, to Bernice, to Marjun, to Deborah and Kevin for their introductions, to the 4B team and the China Dialogue teams who have worked so hard to put this together, and to all of you for being here, for your questions. A recording of this will be on the website. You can read more about it on the China Dialogue website, and do follow our panelists because their work is really impressive and important and critical at this moment. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.